afternoon again. My name is Paweł Wąsowicz, and today I'm here to talk about biological invasions in Iceland from a botanical perspective. To start with, let us look at the definitions of non-native or alien species and invasive species that are included into the Convention of Biological Diversity. So the alien species, or non-native or non-indigenous or foreign exotic species, means basically a species or a lower taxon that is occurring outside its natural range and also outside its dispersal potential. What it means? It means that the species has to occur outside the range it occupies naturally, or could possibly occupy it without direct or indirect introduction or care by humans. On the other hand, invasive alien species are plants, animals, or any other organisms that are non-native to an ecosystem and that can cause an economic or environmental harm or adversely affect human health. The Convention of Biological Diversity says that, in particular, invasive alien species can have a negative impact on biodiversity. They can cause decline or elimination of native species through competition, predation, transmission of pathogens, and the disruption of local ecosystems and ecosystem functions. Scientists have already named 5 main threats to biodiversity, and knowing what they are and how they work can help us to plan research in order to minimize the damage. Now, I say that for Iceland, these 2 threats, so invasive species and climate change, I don't know why it's okay, are the most important, and also, sadly, the least studied threats for biodiversity. That, and I think that these 2 threats will have to be addressed by researchers and politicians in the coming years. Well, biological invasions constitute a major threat to global biodiversity. This is not a hypothesis. This is undisputed scientific fact and has been confirmed by thousands of studies carried out worldwide. And therefore, management of invasive alien species and limiting this threat were placed in the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity of the Convention of Biological Diversity, so-called Aichi biodiversity targets. Unfortunately, still too many of us does not recognize this threat. And in order to raise awareness of this urgent problem, leading ecologists from around the world have published last year a special paper summarizing our knowledge on the effects of invasive alien species. This paper, entitled Scientists' Warning on Invasive Alien Species, have been published in biological reviews last year. They stressed that biological invasions are the major driver of ecosystem degradation, that the number of invasive alien species around the world is increasing rapidly, and there is no evidence that this increase is slowing down. They also stressed that islands and coastal areas are hotspots of invasions. They pointed out that interactions with other drivers of global change are exacerbating current biological invasions and facilitating new ones. And therefore, this simultaneous impact of different drivers of global change can greatly escalate the extent and impacts of invaders. Unfortunately, invasion biology, just as other fields of science, experience a growing pressure from a pandemic. This is a pandemic of post-truth. Just as Carl Sagan put it, a gentle but stable slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. And scientific denialists play one of the key roles in this process. And I would like also to enlarge a bit on this topic too. Well, science denialism is the rejection of undisputed scientific fact. Denialism differs a lot from scientific debate which arises from the uncertainty that is implicit in a scientific method. Ideas that survive in science and become accepted parts of the scientific knowledge, they do so because they are yet to be falsified, or at least provide the most likely explanation that is consistent with the existing body of scientific knowledge. The scientific process relies on what we called informed skepticism and challenges to the prevailing consensus, but these challenges succeeded because the new ideas provide better or more parsimonious explanations to observations. By contrast, denialism, instead of offering better explanations, attempts to manufacture uncertainty in the scientific consensus on otherwise undisputed topic, like these topics I presented here. Here are just examples of current science denialism. For example, the risk of tobacco smoking, risks connected with immunization, causes of AIDS, causes of climate change, evidence for evolution, but also negative effects of invasive alien species. Denialists exploit the fact that all scientific knowledge contains an element of uncertainty. This can lead to, for example, to journalists presenting consensus and contrarian alternatives as balanced, ignoring the fact that the weight of scientific evidence, or the weight of evidence, is heavily in favor of science. And this leads, in my opinion, far too often to conflating debates about policy responses with debates about the supporting science. Denialists use the rich arsenal of methods to manufacture doubt and uncertainty. The use of fake experts, magnified minority strategy, logical fallacies, like, for example, the fallacy of incomplete evidence, note also like as cherry picking, can be given as examples of the most popular methods of disinformation used by science denialists that are targeting also invasion science in Iceland. Sadly, social media, major conventional media, and even web pages of institutions can be mentioned as an arena for such denialist actions. At the same time, the proportion of publications that dismiss the negative impact of invasive alien species in scientific literature is actually less than 0.1%. Therefore, it's obvious that the science denialism aimed to produce disinformation on invasive alien species typically originates from groups with a vested interest in opposition to the scientific consensus, and it's often characterized by downplaying the scope of the threat. It often arises when the science enters the policy arena and policy outcomes threaten to impact financial interests, freedoms, or behaviors of others. So there is probably no coincidence that the original challenges to the orthodoxy of invasion biology came from outside science. Well, I think it's important to remember that there are very few conservation biologists or ecologists that do oppose non-native species per se. What they oppose, it's a subset of those species that was targeted by the Convention on Biological Diversity as threatening ecosystems, habitats, or species. This subset is called invasive alien species. Invasion biologists and managers do not ignore the benefits of introduced species. Nobody wants or tries to eradicate cabbage, potatoes, or carrots. Useful non-native species, however, sometimes may need to be carefully managed because they have a negative impact. And tree invasions can serve as an excellent and scientifically especially well-documented example. It may take decades before severe impact of non-native species become apparent. And we have to be aware of that pronouncing a newly introduced species that is added to a plant community that has no evolution experience of that organism should be carefully watched, and pronouncing such a new introduced species as harmless can lead to a very bad decision about its management. Having said that, let us now proceed to the next part of my lecture, in which I will deal with plant immigration and invasion in a dynamic context. In Iceland, the history of species importation started in 9th century, and only a little is known about what was really happening in the flora during the early history of Iceland. As we can see on this graph, the influx of non-native species was very low for most of the history of the country. Well, this is not surprising if we take into account the fact that during the so-called millennium of misery, Iceland repeatedly experienced natural disasters and epidemics that were wiping out significant proportion of its population. And that the period that we call Little Ice Age, a period of climate cooling, served as an excellent protection against any plant invaders from more southern territories. It seems that the influx of non-native species before 1880s can be attributed to these three factors. What we have to remember, however, is that our picture of the past alien flora of Iceland is very unclear. And since the solid evidence, well, is lacking, and there is a high probability that Little Ice Age could have wiped out some of the old aliens that came with the settlers during the medieval warm period. But with the end of the Little Ice Age, what in Iceland happened around the beginning of 20th century, the situation has changed. Population started to grow rapidly. Development of road network facilitated transportation within Iceland. The amount of trade with foreign partners started to increase very rapidly with growing populations and, well, have been increasing ever since. Icelanders started to show interest in forestry, in horticulture, and all these factors contributed to a steep increase in the amount of non-native species that we can see here on this graph. And this increase lasts now for well over a century. The influx of non-native species to Iceland, reconstructed based on data on first records, is not stable. And we can clearly see some fluctuations or alternating trends that are lasting for decades, but the general picture is quite clear and enables us to predict a significant growth in the number of non-native plant taxa. In fact, about 50% before the end of the century. This trend ensures that Icelandic flora grows by 0.65% every year. That's a lot. And this process is left mostly uncontrolled, not managed in any efficient way, and actions focused on drawing attention to this problem are too often misunderstood and criticized by the member of general public in Iceland, what itself constitutes, at least from my point of view, a huge educational challenge. I just mentioned that climate change coupled with biological invasions is a very dangerous mix for biological diversity. And now I would like to show you how it works in Iceland. Well, we need to first acknowledge that climate change has already activated processes of increased naturalization of alien species in Iceland. Some time ago, tough climatic conditions here in Iceland were working as a main factor responsible for limiting and delaying processes of naturalization of alien plant species. But now the situation is rapidly changing, and the climate change is already facilitating emergence of self-sustaining populations of many species. Next, I would like to move to the second part of my lecture. And here I will introduce some of the well and less well-known Icelandic invasive plant species, and I will try to put this topic also in a dynamic context. I think most of us is quite familiar with the main Icelandic invasive, the lupine. So due to time limitations, I'm not going to introduce the lupine in detail, and I just concentrate on the main point. Namely the pace of its invasion. In order to quantify the spread of the lupine, I divided the whole area of Iceland into 5 by 5 kilometer squares, and retrospectively, I calculated the number of 5 by 5 kilometer squares with confirmed presence of lupine. And here is what comes from this experiment. Well, that's impressive growth, reaching even over 1,000% within the forecast period. Well, terrifying as it might be, we can be quite safe that such an increase will never happen in Iceland. And why? Well, because we will run out of the space for further lupine invasion well before that date. Let us look on the next slide. There are only 4,600 such squares that are available for lupine colonization in this country. Then, depending on the model, we will reach the presence of lupine in 50% of squares well before 2050, and potentially lupine can be present in every such square well before the end of the century. The linear model offers some relief, but it's still suggesting quite a tremendous growth. Well, of course, not every 5 by 5 kilometer square is available for lupine colonization for various reasons, including also climatic conditions. Unfortunately, climate change is not working to our advantage. And well, some attempts has been already made to quantify its impact on the lupine, and the results, well, leave us without any hope on stopping the spread of the species. As we can see on this picture, before the end of the century, the amount of land accessible for lupine colonization, which is here in red, well, will increase enormously. Well, therefore, we can expect that the lupine will very soon reach every single square on this map that is suitable for its growth, and then this curve will probably stabilize quite soon. Well, in my opinion, it would be already before 2050. But then the curve describing the total area covered by lupine, I'm not showing this data here, this curve will start to grow, and very soon. It seems then that the best time for the lupine in Iceland is still ahead of us. This leads me to my next point, which is cow parsley. The ability of the species to spread in Iceland was first noticed in 1940s, when it was invading disturbed habitats in Reykjavik and surroundings. It seems that due to the fact that cow parsley invades very nitrogen-rich soils, it has only a limited potential for a widespread invasion, at least for now. But cow parsley can outcompete lupine and thus complete the environmental damage. Let us look at this cow parsley site in early spring. This is basically a bare ground. Not even mosses are visible. This is because the species form extremely dense stands, not allowing the growth of any other plant species. This picture of tree plantation with a ground cover completely dominated by cow parsley can also provide a view into possible future of tree plantations and development of biodiversity in such areas. I think that due to the limitations I mentioned before, the cow parsley will not be able to spread as widely as lupine, at least not during the coming decades. When we compare the outputs of two models for lupine in red and cow parsley, we can clearly see that the scale of the invasion of these both species is very different. Well, that's about it for this part. And now a few words about the new invasive alien, Senecio pseudarnica. Natural distribution of this species covers northern part of Atlantic and Pacific coast of North America, so here and here, but also northern coasts of the Far East, so the Russia and China and Japan. It grows there mainly in coastal environments. In Iceland, the species was introduced most probably in 1950s and started here as an ornamental, but very soon it moved out from gardens and records of coastal environments started to appear very soon, already in 1980s. Now, the species is present along the whole Icelandic coastline, as we can see on this map, and a closer inspection of just one such tiny dot I made this summer showed that the species Senecio pseudarnica has already colonized over 3 kilometers of the coastline, reaching 100% cover in some places and huge population size. We speak here about tens of thousands of flowering stems. Well, of course, we need to know more about the effects of these species, but in order to know more, we need to intensify research, and this calls for financing and clear policies. I think that waiting won't remove the problem. It will just intensify it, and at the end, the real cost of invasions will include not only research, but also environmental and, most importantly, economical damage. Examples of such damage from all over the world are well known and huge. Well, it doesn't take a genius to understand what effect this fast and dense growing plant will have on the coastal plant communities. As we can see here, not much is left once the canopy of the Senecio pseudoarnica closes. Perfect habitat match between the non-native and native range, as well as very close climate matching that is depicted on this graph here. Very light seeds, very potent rhizomatous growth. Here we see a Senecio pseudoarnica growing through asphalt. Very minimal habitat requirements and ability to form extremely dense stands. I think all these properties will surely contribute to the success of the species in invading Icelandic coastlines. The invasion trajectory leads from a diverse coastline vegetation to a large monoculture stand of Senecio pseudoarnica. When we take all this into account, I think no one will be surprised to see this graph, showing that we will surely witness a vigorous growth in the number of sites occupied by Senecio pseudoarnica before the end of the century. I think it would be also interesting to add that the species has already reached northern Norway, where it invades very similar coastal environments. As we can see, this is Balsfjorden, close to Tromsø in northern Norway. And it's also in this part of Norway totally out of any control. The last, but certainly not the least interesting during my talk today is lodgepole pine. Well, the lodgepole pine was introduced in Iceland in 1940s. By 1960s, the species became very widely used, and nowadays is present throughout the country and very popular in forest plantations. Native range of lodgepole pine covers the western part of Northern America, but assisted by humans, the species managed to spread quite widely across the globe, reaching distant locations like the southern part of Southern America, New Zealand, and Europe, and also Iceland. In Iceland, lodgepole pine is very popular in tree plantations and already present throughout the country. When we take into account the fact that this is a pioneer species and very fast growing, that it has a very small seeds and very short juvenile period, short interval between large seed crops, then there should be no surprise that the species has been classified as one of the most invasive conifer species and became, in fact, highly invasive in most of the regions where it was introduced due to afforestation efforts. Unfortunately, our knowledge on lodgepole pine in Iceland is still very limited, and challenges include distribution mapping, identification of areas where the invasion of the species is already underway, assessment of the impact of Pinus contorta invasion, if it's localized or widespread, and introduction of control measures. But what we do know is that the invasion is most probably underway in many places in Iceland, and also that the species very easily invades open habitats, even habitats with a rich vegetation cover, such as heaths. Let us the picture speak for itself. Here we have an example of an area in southeastern Iceland. This is Steinadalur, where the invasion of Pinus contorta is underway. And as you can see, in an area with a very rich vegetation cover. Every such arrow on this picture is one tree of Pinus contorta, lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine is increasing its distribution in many places in Iceland, and in an uncontrollable way. Well, it colonizes easily disturbed habitats, such as this roadside, for example. It can invade grasslands, like this. It can reach high elevations and areas that are very distant from the nearest sources of seeds. This is picture from Lyngdalsheiði. It's over 9 kilometers from the nearest pine plantation. Invasion of Pinus contorta has most probably a strong negative effect on native species by reducing the number of native species. And we can suspect that when it starts, then the invasion is progressing very rapidly. Until recently, what I said now, these were only hypotheses that were based on the rich scientific literature of the subject and lots of research that were carried out in other places. But this year, thanks to financial support from Kvískerjasjóður, we managed to verify this hypothesis in the field. And what I will present now will be just a very short summary of the most important findings with almost no discussion. But I plan to deliver a lecture on this problem early next year when we will have the final results of this project. Lodgepole pine plantation in Steinadalur in southeastern Iceland was at the center of our attention during this research project. And first seedlings of lodgepole pine started to emerge outside plantation margins as early as in 1985. But fortunately, in 2010, Hanna Björk Gudmundsdóttir carried out systematic research focused on qualitative estimation of the extent of lodgepole pine invasion in Steinadalur. In 2021, we undertook the same measurements in order to see how fast the invasion is progressing in this region. In order to do that, we analyzed 22 transects of different length, and as well as carried out systematic searches across the whole Steinadalur Valley in order to estimate main parameters of lodgepole pine invasion and its impact on biodiversity. As I said before, the lodgepole pine is characterized by fast growth and the huge dispersal potential. This picture has been taken over 200, in fact, about 250 meters from the original plantation. And this original plantation, we can see these tall trees here in the corner. But as you can see, we are now 250 meters from the plantation, and the number of pine trees is still quite impressive. But of course, the extent of invasion is much bigger than modest 200 meters. Here we can see results of our research during the summer, and due to where we made systematic searches carried out in the whole area of Steinadalur, and these searches allowed us to estimate the real extent of invasion. That includes not only valley bottom, as we can see here, and it's very widespread, but also the lodgepole pine made a huge progress up the mountain slopes. What happened just in recent years? But, well, let us look at the numbers. The graph here shows a clear exponential growth in the total area colonized by the lodgepole pine and driven mostly by invasion into habitats such as heath and low birch forest. The increase in the total number of all pine trees present in the transects we studied 10 years ago and now, sorry, 11 years ago and now, follows the same exponential trajectory. So what we speak about here is an increase from 0.25 to almost 2.5 kilometers square as far as area is concerned, and an increase from 400 plants to over 3,000 plants in 11 years. Based on the data from our research, this year we also managed to estimate a mean spread of lodgepole pine invasion. And here we can see that the main invasion speed accelerated from 8.55 meters per year to 61.1 meters per year just during a decade. As I mentioned before, lodgepole pine invasion proceeds also up the mountain slopes. And what we can see here, these are violin plots that are similar to traditional box plots, except that they also show the probability density of the data at different values. And what we can see here is that the same, but maybe less drastic, increasing trend is clearly visible. The maximum speed of uphill invasion was initially about 2 meters per year, but now the speed has increased substantially. And during the last decade, well, to almost 5 meters per year uphill. what we can see on this picture is a tree plantation, again, here in the corner, these tall trees here, but the rest, all these plants here, this is a product of lodgepole pine invasion into the heathland and low birch heath community. The newly formed pine woodland can be very dense. In fact, it's sometimes so dense that walking through it can be quite challenging, as we can see on these pictures. Well, lodgepole pine does not seem to be very fussy when it comes to environmental conditions and can invade a variety of different habitats from stony bottom of the river valley, we can see here, through dense heath vegetation, low birch heath communities with dense vegetation, again, a number of new plants colonizing such habitat, and even birch woodlands. Here we can see a single lodgepole pine invading such an area. Our research clearly suggests that lodgepole pine can have a negative effect on vascular plant biodiversity. Here we can see an example of a heath. This is a quite rich. Quite rich in species, but already invaded by lodgepole pine. You can see here a small seedling of a lodgepole pine. And then an example of what happens when the canopy cover closes. We can clearly see a complete eradication of heath species and extremely species poor vascular flora. In fact, we speak about just 2 species of vascular flora in this research square. These graphs show what we could see on previous slides, but well, in a bit more elegant way. When we compared a pine plantation with a birch forest or already pine invaded heath, we can see that low values of alpha biodiversity. And it doesn't matter if we measure the biodiversity with just with species richness or with Shannon diversity richness. Always the pine plantation is really species poor. Well, to end this part of my presentation, I would like to show you 2 pictures showing the progress of lodgepole pine the lodgepole pine has made in Steinadaru during the last decade. This is the same place and picture taken in 2010 and after 11 years. I think it's worth remember that it's not only invasive plants that contribute to the decline of local native populations. And invasive animals, such as this tiny insect, Scolioneuria betuleti, have also potential to contribute to the decline of native flora. The species I found for the first time in Iceland in Akureyri back in 2017 has a huge potential to cause defoliation in native birch. This problem have been investigated by us already back in 2017, just a few weeks after the records of the species were made, and results showed that the total damage of the leaf area in birch trees in Akureyri reached almost 40%. There is only a little doubt that this species came to Iceland with the help of humans, most probably by the importation of foreign plants and most probably with the soil that contained eggs of this fly. Well, there is no doubt that much more such invasives are to come, just in the coming years. Biological invasions in the future are likely to be different in many respects from the past and current invasions. This is because of the emergence of new pathways and increasingly complex interactions among the global change drivers that may increase the susceptibility of the ecosystems to invasion driven degradation. Well, one should not forget that many potential future invaders have already been introduced. For example, they grow in our gardens. What they didn't do, they just haven't yet become invasive, or they haven't yet manifested an impact. Therefore, in practical terms, the invasion depth, what means the time-delayed spread of species already introduced to region, and the inevitable escalation of their impacts, it's a crucial dimension of invasive alien species management. and must be explicitly incorporated in all strategic plans. Well, in Iceland, all components of invasion depth are growing, and most probably more than we can even imagine, since we have not enough research carried out in this field. But this depth will of course incur costs, and apart from major economical costs that we still haven't seen and therefore haven't not realized here in Iceland, one of the most devastating and most irreversible costs of invasion or invasion depth will be the biodiversity loss. It's very likely that the simultaneous effects of alien species and climate change will have devastating consequences by causing species extinction, by causing biotic homogenization, and we can be quite sure that that the damage to biodiversity caused by invasive alien species will happen. And this damage is in fact happening in front of our eyes. This is just up to us how great this damage will be. Well, that's all for me, and thank you very much.
Þakka kærlega fyrir, Pavel.
Ja,
Nú hefur við nokkrar mínútur fyrir spurningar. Hvort sem að þær koma einhvers staðar að utan eða úr sölunum á Akureyri og í Garðabæ. Þannig að endilega verið duglega að senda inn eitthvað til okkar. En ég var einmitt, ég bý nú þarna á norðanverðu Álftanesi þar sem að Pavel sýndi glæru áðan með stormþuli og var einmitt í útreiðatúr þarna við Seilu í sumar og var að furða mig á þessari gulu plöntu sem að væri þarna allsráðandi út allt. Og þarna í kringum húsið mitt erum við líka að berjast við skógarkerfil og tröllakvönn.
Já, það nóg af ágengum plöntum á Álftanesi. Ég samála það.
En ég held jafnvel að sem mögulega detta inn spurning úr salnum á Akureyri.
Já.
Eru fleiri tegundir sem viðbúið að verði ágengar á næstunni?
This is well, not easy to say that. But well, when we take into account that like 10 years ago, we were talking just about lupine and copase, and now we have at least several species that started to spread really aggressively during the last decade. Then we just see what's the general trend, but I think that it's pretty impossible to predict what exactly the species will be. This is also because we don't have any organized any organized actions that are aimed to monitor the influx of species. And in fact, we don't know what is coming in, and therefore it's also difficult to predict which species will become invasive in the near future. But the new invasive they will appear. This is sure, because of the huge influx of species that is just not controlled, and because of the climate change. As I pointed out here in this presentation, the hotter it will be, the easier for plants will be to produce offspring and to propagate.
Hér önnur spurning að norðan. Nú stafafura ekki flokkuð sem ágeng á heimasíðu Náttúrufræðistofnunar. Það að fara að breytast?
Well, I don't know, because I'm not responsible for deciding which species is invasive and which species is not. I can just say that based on the research we made this year, this is highly probable that lodgepole pine, stafafura, is just highly invasive. And well, this is not. It doesn't surprise me at all, because that's the way the species behaves all over the world. So it would be really strange to see that in Iceland it behaves in another way. Yeah, I would answer this question like that.
Takk fyrir það. Það eru ekki fleiri spurningar komnar. Þannig að áður en við hættum þá vil ég vekja athygli á næstarhafnaþingi. Það er Guðríður Gyða Eyjólfsdóttir, sveppafræðingur hjá Náttúrufræðistofnun, sem ætlar að fjalla vistkerfi rakra húsa á Íslandi, innimygla í nærmynd. Og það er ætlunin að hún flytji það erindi í salnum í Háskólanum á Akureyri. Það eftir 2 vikur, en það var að detta inn spurning á vefnum. Hvað til ráða, einkum með stafafuru? Hvað hægt að gera?
Well,
stór spurning.
This is a very wide, yes. What to do? Well, I mean, I think that the stafafura is already present all across Iceland. So we probably won't be able to stop the invasion, and probably won't be able to stop the damage to the biodiversity. What we can do, we can probably, if there is a because this is political decision, so we can try to minimize the damage. And well, how can be damage minimized? Well, for example, by not spreading the species more. The damage can be minimized by some sort of actions that are aimed to eliminate the species from the wild environments, so that the species is just kept in plantations. But of course, this is very difficult on first place, and it will also cost a lot.
Heyrðu, Pavel, það detta inn alveg allt nokkrar spurningar. Hér Jóhann Þórsson sem spyr: Niðurstöðurnar sem að þú sýnir frá Steinadal virðast vera í ósamræmi við gögn sem kynnt voru á líffræðiráðstefnunni fyrir nokkrum dögum, þar sem lítið var gert úr útbreiðslu stafafurunar. Hverja telur þú vera skýringuna á því?
Well, the main explanation is, I think, just a bad methodology. What was presented on biological conference, this is just a bad science, I would say, because what was presented, this was just results from a single transect here or here. I don't know which transect they selected. I'm just responsible for my results, and I can tell you that we analyzed the huge range of 22 transects, in fact, and the pictures also speak for itself. So that's the way I see it. So this is probably a sort of a bad methodology that leads to this that led to this. That led to the fact that my results and our results and the results presented on the conference are not compatible. Well, I don't know.
Hér spurning frá nafnlausum. Þegar hætta metin af ágengni tegunda, verður þá ekki að taka inn í myndina hversu erfitt að fjarlægja hana af svæði? Myndi taka nema 1 dag og nokkra vélsægir að útrýma stafafuru úr Steinadal ef vilji væri fyrir því?
Well, if we want to remove the lodgepole pine from Steinadalur, well, this is of course not a project for one day, and from different reasons. Because, for example, well, first of all, the number of trees here is tremendous. So if we even send the people here to cut every single tree, well, which I think is undoable at the moment, because first you need to find every single tree, and with such an extent of invasion, this is barely possible. And this is the one problem. And the other problem is that, the problem has been already named in the literature, that the cutting the lodgepole pine gives no guarantee that the species, that the lodgepole pine will not grow up again. And actually, during our research here in Steinadalur, we've seen a lot of examples when the tree was cut almost close to the ground, but just one single branch was left, very small, and from this very small branch, the whole tree that was 3 or 4 meters tall started to regrow, because the species is just it's very difficult to eliminate. But this is just not just in Iceland. This has been confirmed also in other countries.
Það eru, þó að klukkan svo orðin 4, þá eru 2 spurningar. Brynjar Skúlason spyr, var óskað eftir samstarfi við skógræktina rannsóknir og útbreiðslu stafafuru og ef ekki, hvers vegna?
Well, we didn't have to ask for any I don't know cooperation, because we have the knowledge and ability to do it ourselves. So, I think that's the easiest explanation.
Þá hérna frá Einari Þorleifssyni. Takk fyrir góðan fyrirlestur. Alaskavíðir sýnist mér vera að dreifa sér hratt landið. Myndir þú flokka hann í hóp með stafafurinni?
Well, it's difficult to say something sure. Something convincible, because I would like to stick to the research. So I think that when we want to name species as an invasive, then we need to have research that is backing this decision. And as I mentioned here, I also see the problem of this Salix species, but of course we are lacking research to confirm this. So I also see this problem, and I think it could be invasive or potentially invasive species, but the research is lacking to confirm that.
Takk fyrir. Þá held ég að við ljúkum þess í dag. Ég þakka þér kærlega fyrir fyrirlesturinn, Pavel, og ykkur hlustendum fyrir að fylgjast með. Ég vil koma að einni leiðréttingu, ég leiðréttar sjálfa mig, að fundarsalurinn á Akureyri ekki við háskólann, heldur í Borgum við Norðurslóð. Sjáumst þar eftir 2 vikur.
Thank you.
Bless.
Bless, takk.